Clayton Mercer dumped his injured champion horse in a desolate hollow and signed a bet wagering his entire ranch that the crippled animal would never take another step. He never imagined a starving 16-year-old boy living under an abandoned grain silo would be the one to collect on that bet. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sky over Hartwell County hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain that would never quite fall. Beneath it, stretching as far as the eye could see, lay the vast empire of Clayton Mercer, a man whose wealth was measured not just in acres, but in the fear and respect he commanded from everyone within 100 miles. His ranch, known simply as Mercer Land, was a monument to ambition and ruthlessness, a sprawling testament to what a man could achieve when he cared more about winning than about the cost of victory. The fences that bordered his property were painted white and pristine, a sharp contrast to the weathered barns and humble homesteads that dotted the surrounding countryside. Clayton Mercer had built his fortune on cattle, oil, and horses, but it was the horses that truly captured his obsession. He bred champions, animals whose bloodlines were worth more than most families earned in a lifetime, and he displayed their trophies in a glass case in his study, like a general displaying medals of war. Among all his prized possessions, none held more value than a chestnut stallion named Sovereign. This horse was the crown jewel of Mercer Land, a creature of such grace and power that people traveled from distant states just to watch him run. His coat gleamed like polished copper in the sunlight, and his stride was so smooth it seemed as though he floated above the earth rather than touched it. Sovereign had won every race he entered, every competition he faced, and Clayton Mercer had come to see the horse as an extension of himself, a living symbol of his dominance over the land and everyone on it. He would stand at the fence rail during training sessions, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Sovereign move with a satisfaction that bordered on worship. This horse was invincible, he believed. This horse was his legacy. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It happened on a Tuesday morning during what should have been a routine training exercise. The ground was slick from an overnight drizzle, and Sovereign was running at full speed when his front hoof caught an unseen rut in the earth. The sound that followed was something that would haunt everyone who heard it, a sickening crack that echoed across the field like a gunshot. Sovereign went down hard, his magnificent body crashing into the mud, and when he tried to rise, his front leg buckled beneath him at an angle that made the ranch hands turn away in horror. The veterinarian arrived within the hour, his face grim as he examined the damage. The diagnosis was devastating, a compound fracture of the cannon bone, the kind of injury that ended careers, and more often than not, ended lives. Clayton Mercer stood in the doorway of the stable, watching as the veterinarian wrapped Sovereign's leg in temporary bandages, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He had invested everything in this horse, not just money, but his reputation, his pride, his very identity as the most powerful man in Hartwell County. And now, in one careless moment, it had all come crashing down. The veterinarian approached him carefully, knowing the rancher's temper all too well, and delivered the news that Clayton had been dreading. The horse would never race again. With extensive surgery, months of rehabilitation, and constant care, Sovereign might eventually walk without pain, but the days of competition were over. The animal that had once been worth a fortune was now, in Clayton's eyes, worthless. That same morning, on the opposite edge of Hartwell County, where the paved roads turned to dirt and the houses grew sparse and forgotten, a 16-year-old boy named Eli Walker woke up beneath the rusted skeleton of an abandoned grain silo. His blanket was a tattered moving blanket he had found in a dumpster behind the hardware store, and his pillow was a rolled-up jacket that had belonged to his father before the cancer took him 3 winters ago. Eli had been on his own ever since, drifting from place to place, taking odd jobs when he could find them and going hungry when he could not. He had learned to read the weather by the color of the sky, to find water in places most people overlooked, and to make himself invisible when the situation required it. Life had not been kind to Eli Walker, but it had made him resourceful, patient, and surprisingly gentle despite all the hardness the world had shown him. Eli had always had a way with animals. Even as a small child, before his mother left and his father got sick, he would spend hours in the fields behind their tiny house, sitting perfectly still until the wild creatures forgot he was there. Deer would graze within arm's reach of him. Birds would land on his shoulders. His father used to say that Eli had been born with an old soul, someone who understood the language of living things in a way that most humans had forgotten. It was this gift, this quiet connection to the natural world, that would soon change everything. The news of Sovereign's injury spread through Hartwell County like wildfire, carried on the tongues of farmhands and shop owners who had nothing better to discuss. By noon, everyone knew that Clayton Mercer's prized stallion was finished, and by evening, they knew something else. The rancher had decided to dispose of the horse rather than spend money on an animal that could no longer serve his purposes. He had given orders to have Sovereign transported to the far edge of his property, to a desolate stretch of land where unwanted animals were sometimes left to face their fate alone. It was cruel, the townspeople whispered, but no one dared to say it to Clayton Mercer's face. No one dared to challenge a man who could destroy their livelihoods with a single phone call. But Eli Walker, who had nothing left to lose, heard those whispers from his hiding place behind the feed store. He heard about the magnificent horse that was being thrown away like garbage, and something stirred in his chest, a mixture of anger and compassion that he had not felt in a very long time. That night, as the stars emerged above Hartwell County and Clayton Mercer sat in his study drowning his disappointment in expensive whiskey, Eli made a decision that would set into motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. He was going to find that horse, and he was going to save it. The night was cold and moonless when Eli set out across the fields, navigating by instinct and the distant glow of ranch lights that dotted the horizon like fallen stars. He moved carefully, staying low to the ground and keeping to the shadows that pooled beneath the scattered oak trees. He knew these lands well enough to avoid the main roads, well enough to slip through fence lines without being seen, and well enough to know exactly where Clayton Mercer dumped the things he no longer wanted. It was a place the locals called the Hollow, a forgotten stretch of scrubland at the very edge of Mercer property, where the soil was too rocky for grazing and the trees grew twisted and sparse. People said that animals left there rarely survived more than a few days, picked off by coyotes or simply surrendering to thirst and exhaustion. The thought of that magnificent horse lying alone in such a place made Eli's stomach turn with a cold fury he could barely contain. It took him nearly 3 hours to reach the hollow, and by the time he arrived, his legs ached and his throat was dry from breathing the dust that rose with every step. The landscape here was different from the rest of the county, harsh and unforgiving, dotted with boulders and patches of dead grass that crackled underfoot. Eli paused at the top of a small rise and scanned the darkness below, searching for any sign of movement. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and the vague outlines of scrub brush swaying in the wind. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he spotted something that made his heart clench in his chest. There, lying motionless beside a cluster of rocks, was Sovereign. Even in the dim starlight, Eli could see that the horse was in bad shape. His once gleaming coat was matted with mud and sweat, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that seemed to take tremendous effort. The injured leg was wrapped in bandages that had already begun to unravel, stained dark with what Eli knew must be blood. The stallion's eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, as though he had already resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him in this desolate place. For a moment, Eli simply stood there, overwhelmed by the sight of such a magnificent creature reduced to such a pitiful state. Then he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and began his careful descent into the hollow. He approached slowly, making no sudden movements, speaking in a low and steady voice that he hoped would calm the frightened animal. "Easy there, big fella," he murmured, keeping his hands visible and his posture relaxed. "I am not going to hurt you. I am here to help." Sovereign's ears flickered at the sound of his voice, and the horse lifted his head slightly, regarding Eli with eyes that held equal parts fear and exhaustion. Eli could see the tension in the animal's muscles, the instinct to flee warring with the knowledge that flight was impossible in his current condition. He stopped a few feet away and lowered himself to the ground, making himself as small and unthreatening as possible. For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind whispered through the dead grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the absent moon. Eventually, Sovereign's breathing began to slow, and some of the tension drained from his body. Eli took this as permission to inch closer, close enough now to see the full extent of the horse's injuries. The leg was worse than he had feared, swollen and hot to the touch even through the bandages, and there were scrapes and cuts along Sovereign's flank, where he had apparently tried to drag himself across the rocky ground. But beneath all the damage, Eli could see what this horse had once been: the powerful chest, the noble head, the spirit that still flickered somewhere behind those pain-dulled eyes. This animal was not ready to die. He just needed someone to give him a reason to live. Eli spent the rest of the night beside Sovereign, talking to him in that same quiet voice, telling him stories about nothing in particular just to fill the silence with something other than fear. He shared the last of his water, trickling it carefully into the horse's mouth, and when the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the sky, he knew that he faced an impossible choice. He could not carry a horse, he could not call for help without revealing his own precarious situation, and he certainly could not leave Sovereign here to die alone. The only option, as far as Eli could see, was to somehow get the horse on his feet and lead him to safety, one agonizing step at a time. It took nearly an hour just to coax Sovereign into standing. Eli talked him through it, encouraging him with gentle words and patient hands, supporting as much of the horse's weight as his own thin frame could manage. When Sovereign finally rose, trembling violently but upright, Eli felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away quickly and focused on the task at hand. He fashioned a makeshift lead from his belt and a length of rope he had brought in his pack, and together, the boy and the broken horse began the long journey away from the hollow. They moved at a pace that would have frustrated anyone watching, barely faster than a crawl, with frequent stops to let Sovereign rest and catch his breath. Eli knew they could not return to any of the main roads where they might be spotted by Mercer's men, so he led them along the creek beds and through the thickest patches of woodland, following routes that only someone who had spent years hiding from the world would know. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles, and both of them were exhausted beyond measure. But Eli had a destination in mind, a place he had discovered during his wanderings, an abandoned farmstead tucked into a valley so overgrown that most people had forgotten it existed. If they could just make it there, they would have shelter, water from an old well that still functioned, and most importantly, privacy. The sun was beginning to set when they finally arrived. The farmstead was exactly as Eli remembered it, a collection of weathered buildings slowly being reclaimed by nature, with a barn that still had most of its roof and a pasture surrounded by fences that, while sagging, remained mostly intact. Eli led Sovereign into the barn and settled him onto a bed of old hay that he quickly gathered from the corners. The horse sank down with a groan of relief, and Eli knelt beside him, examining the injured leg with careful fingers. The bandages needed changing, the wound needed cleaning, and somehow he needed to find food for both of them. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. They were alive, and against all odds, they were together. The first week at the abandoned farmstead was the hardest. Eli barely slept, dividing his time between caring for Sovereign and scavenging for the supplies they desperately needed. He made trips into town under cover of darkness, slipping behind grocery stores to salvage discarded produce and raiding dumpsters for anything that might be useful. He found clean bandages at a veterinary clinic that had left its back door unlocked, along with a bottle of antiseptic solution that he guarded like treasure. He learned which plants growing wild in the fields could reduce inflammation, and which could be made into poultices that would draw infection from wounds. Every piece of knowledge his father had ever shared about caring for animals, every trick he had picked up during his years of surviving on the margins, he now poured into the single-minded task of keeping Sovereign alive. The horse, for his part, seemed to understand that Eli was trying to help him. In those early days, when the pain was at its worst, and the slightest movement sent shudders through his powerful frame, Sovereign would look at Eli with eyes that held something like gratitude. He allowed the boy to handle his injured leg, to clean the wound and change the bandages, even though the process must have been agonizing. He ate whatever food Eli could provide, grain stolen from unlocked feed bins and grass cut by hand from the meadow behind the barn. And slowly, so slowly that at first Eli was not sure if he was imagining it, Sovereign began to improve. The swelling in his legs started to recede. The infection that had threatened to spread was beaten back by Eli's relentless care. The light that had nearly faded from the stallion's eyes began to return, brighter each day, like embers being coaxed back into flame. As the days turned into weeks, Eli established a routine that gave structure to their isolated existence. Each morning he would wake before dawn to check on Sovereign, examining the injured leg for any signs of setback and refreshing the water bucket he had placed in the corner of the stall. Then he would spend an hour or two foraging, gathering whatever food and supplies he could find before the world woke up and his presence might be noticed. The afternoons were dedicated to rehabilitation, gentle exercises designed to keep Sovereign's muscles from wasting away during his long recovery. At first, this meant simply encouraging the horse to shift his weight from one leg to another. But as the weeks passed and Sovereign grew stronger, Eli began leading him on short walks around the barn, then around the pasture, then along the overgrown paths that wound through the valley. It was during one of these walks that Eli first saw Sovereign try to run. They were in the far corner of the pasture, where the grass grew tallest and the morning sun fell warm and golden across the earth. Sovereign had been moving well that day, his limp barely noticeable, and there was an energy in his step that Eli had not seen before. Without warning, the horse pulled ahead, breaking into a trot that quickly accelerated into something faster. Eli's heart leapt into his throat as he watched, terrified that Sovereign would injure himself again, but also mesmerized by the sheer beauty of the animal in motion. Even with his damaged leg, even after everything he had been through, Sovereign was magnificent. He ran in a wide circle around the pasture, his mane streaming behind him like a flag of victory, and when he finally slowed and returned to Eli's side, both of them were breathing hard, but both of them were smiling in their own way. That night, as Eli sat in the barn watching Sovereign sleep, he allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in a very long time. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. For so long, his life had been about survival, about getting through one day so he could face the next. He had stopped dreaming about the future because the future had never seemed to hold anything but more of the same hardship he already knew. But now, watching this horse who had been given up for dead, who had been thrown away by a man who saw him as nothing more than a tool, Eli began to wonder if maybe things could be different. Maybe they could both find a way to heal. Maybe they could both find a place where they belonged. Meanwhile, back at Mercer Land, Clayton Mercer was dealing with problems of his own. The loss of Sovereign had wounded more than just his pride. Word had spread throughout the horse breeding community that his prized stallion was finished. And suddenly the phone calls that had once flooded his office, inquiries about stud fees and purchase prices, had slowed to a trickle. Other ranchers who had once treated him with deference now seemed to regard him with something uncomfortably close to pity. Clayton was not a man who handled pity well. He responded the way he always responded to challenges, with aggression and the liberal application of money. He purchased 3 new horses, all of them young and promising, and he hired a new trainer to replace the one he had blamed for Sovereign's accident. But no matter how many acquisitions he made, he could not shake the feeling that something had been taken from him, something he could not simply buy back. It was during this period of wounded pride that Clayton first heard the rumors. One of his ranch hands, a man named Garrett, who had been with the Mercer operation for nearly a decade, mentioned offhandedly that some of the folks in town were talking about a horse that had been spotted in the hills east of the county. A chestnut horse, they said, with a distinctive white blaze on his forehead. Clayton dismissed the rumor at first, assuming that Sovereign had long since succumbed to his injuries in the hollow. But the rumor persisted, growing more detailed with each telling, and eventually Clayton sent Garrett to investigate. What Garrett found when he reached the hollow was nothing. No horse, no bones, no sign that an animal had ever been left there to die. Someone had taken Sovereign. Someone had stolen what belonged to Clayton Mercer. And that, the rancher decided as he poured himself another glass of whiskey, was something he could not allow to stand. Clayton Mercer was not a patient man, and the discovery that someone had taken Sovereign from the hollow ignited a fury in him that burned hotter with each passing day. He hired a private investigator from the city, a sharp-eyed man named Durrell, who specialized in tracking down stolen property and the people foolish enough to take it. Durrell arrived at Mercer Land in a black sedan with tinted windows, carrying a briefcase full of surveillance equipment and a reputation for getting results through methods that rarely appeared in official reports. Clayton did not care about the methods. He cared only about finding the horse that had been taken from him and punishing whoever had the audacity to think they could steal from Clayton Mercer without consequence. The 2 men shook hands in the study where Sovereign's trophies still gleamed behind glass, and Clayton outlined his demands with cold precision. Find the horse, find whoever took it, and make them understand what happens when someone crosses me. Durrell began his investigation by canvassing the area around the hollow, searching for any clues that might indicate which direction the horse had been taken. He found hoofprints in the soft earth near the creek, partially obscured by rain but still visible to a trained eye, leading east toward the hills that bordered Mercer property. He spoke to farmers and shop owners in the nearby towns, showing them photographs of Sovereign and asking if they had seen anything unusual in recent weeks. Most people shook their heads and claimed ignorance, unwilling to involve themselves in anything connected to Clayton Mercer. But a few offered fragments of information, mentions of a boy who sometimes appeared at the back doors of restaurants asking for scraps, or a figure seen walking along the creek beds in the early morning hours. Durrell collected these fragments like pieces of a puzzle, and slowly, methodically, he began to assemble them into a picture that pointed toward the forgotten valley where Eli and Sovereign had made their refuge. Eli, unaware of the danger closing in around him, continued his daily routine of caring for the horse who had become his only companion. The bond between them had deepened into something that went beyond simple gratitude or dependence. They had developed their own language, a system of gestures and sounds that allowed them to communicate in ways that words could never capture. Eli would whistle a certain tune when it was time to exercise, and Sovereign would respond with a soft nicker of acknowledgement. The horse would nudge Eli's shoulder when he sensed the boy was tired or discouraged, offering silent comfort through simple physical contact. They ate together, slept near each other, and faced each new day as partners in a shared struggle that neither of them fully understood, but both of them embraced completely. Sovereign's recovery continued to exceed every expectation Eli had dared to hold. The leg that had once been swollen and useless now bore weight without visible pain, and although a slight limp remained when the horse moved at speed, it was nothing compared to the devastating injury he had sustained. Eli had fashioned a kind of brace from leather straps and wooden splints, providing additional support during their increasingly ambitious exercise sessions. He had also discovered that certain stretching movements, performed slowly and carefully, seemed to increase Sovereign's flexibility and reduce the stiffness that accumulated overnight. What had begun as desperate improvisation had evolved into something approaching a genuine rehabilitation program, informed by instinct and observation rather than formal training, but effective nonetheless. One afternoon, as Eli was leading Sovereign through a series of exercises in the pasture, the horse suddenly stopped and raised his head, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Eli felt the change in the animal's posture immediately and scanned the tree line for any sign of what had captured Sovereign's interest. For a long moment, he saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the forest where the shadows pooled deepest, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure withdrawing into the darkness too quick to identify but definitely human. Eli's blood ran cold. In all the weeks he had spent at the abandoned farmstead, he had never seen another person anywhere near the property. The isolation had been his greatest protection, and now it seemed that protection had been compromised. That night, Eli did not sleep. He sat in the doorway of the barn, with a rusted pitchfork across his knees, watching the darkness for any sign of intrusion. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had someone from town followed him during one of his supply runs? Had a hunter stumbled upon the farmstead by accident? Or had Clayton Mercer, the man who had thrown Sovereign away like garbage, somehow discovered where his discarded horse had ended up? The questions circled through Eli's thoughts like vultures, and by the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he had made a decision. They needed to be ready to run. He spent the day preparing, gathering their meager supplies into a pack that could be grabbed at a moment's notice, and scouting possible escape routes through the hills. If someone came for them, he would not let them take Sovereign without a fight. But the days passed, and no one came. Eli began to wonder if he had imagined the figure in the trees, if his exhausted mind had conjured a threat from shadows and paranoia. He relaxed his vigilance slightly, though he never fully lowered his guard. Sovereign seemed to sense the lingering tension in his caretaker and responded with increased attentiveness, staying closer to Eli during their walks and watching the tree line with the same wary suspicion. They were partners now in every sense of the word, bound together by circumstance and choice, and whatever came next, they would face it together. What Eli did not know was that Durrell had indeed found the farmstead. The investigator had watched from the forest edge, documenting the location and observing the boy and horse from a distance. He had seen enough to confirm that this was Sovereign, the missing stallion that Clayton Mercer wanted recovered. But rather than approach immediately, Durrell had chosen to withdraw and report his findings to his employer. The decision about what to do next would be Clayton's to make, and Durrell suspected that the rancher would want to handle this matter personally. After all, this was no longer simply about recovering stolen property. This was about sending a message that no one, not even a homeless boy with nothing to lose, could take what belonged to Clayton Mercer and escape the consequences. The morning Clayton Mercer arrived at the abandoned farmstead, the sky was the color of bruised fruit, heavy clouds pressing down on the valley like a weight that threatened to crush everything beneath it. He came not alone, but with an entourage that announced his power and intentions without requiring a single word. 3 pickup trucks rolled down the overgrown path, their engines growling through the silence that had protected Eli and Sovereign for so many weeks. Durrell sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, pointing the way with professional detachment, while Garrett and 2 other ranch hands occupied the trucks behind. Clayton himself drove the lead truck, his hands tight on the steering wheel and his jaws set, with the determination of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted and did not intend to start now. Eli heard them coming before he saw them. The sound of engines was so foreign to this place that it took him a moment to identify what he was hearing, and by the time he understood, there was no opportunity to run. He stood in the doorway of the barn, his thin frame silhouetted against the dim interior where Sovereign shifted nervously in his stall, and watched as the trucks emerged from the tree line and came to a stop in the clearing before him. The doors opened almost simultaneously, and men began to emerge, spreading out in a loose semicircle that cut off any possible avenue of escape. Eli felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain still, to project a calm he did not feel. He had known this moment might come. He had prepared himself for it as best he could. Now all that remained was to face it with whatever courage he could muster. Clayton Mercer stepped out of his truck last, taking his time, letting the weight of his presence settle over the scene before he spoke. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with silver hair that he kept cropped short and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes were expensive but practical, the uniform of a man who had worked his way to wealth and never forgot the labor that got him there. He looked at Eli the way one might look at an insect that had crawled across the dinner table, with disgust and faint disbelief that such a creature had the audacity to exist in his presence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere behind Eli, Sovereign let out a low, anxious whinny. "So you are the one who stole my horse," Clayton said at last, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The authority in his tone was absolute, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I have to admit, I expected someone more impressive. You are just a boy, a homeless boy, from what I understand. Did you really think you could take something from me and get away with it?" Eli swallowed hard, but held his ground. "I did not steal him," he said, and although his voice was quieter than Clayton's, it did not waver. "You threw him away. You left him to die alone because he could not race anymore. I found him and I saved him. That does not make him stolen. That makes him rescued." Clayton's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of anger at being contradicted by someone so far beneath his station. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them with a single deliberate stride. "That horse belongs to me," he said, each word clipped and precise. "I have papers that prove it. I have records of his bloodline, his training, every dollar I invested in him. What do you have? Nothing. You are nothing. And you have the nerve to stand there and tell me what I did or did not do with my own property." "He is not property," Eli replied, and now there was heat in his voice, a passion that surprised even himself. "He is a living thing. He feels pain and fear and hope, just like you do, just like I do. You might own him on paper, but you stopped deserving him the moment you decided his life was worthless. I watched him almost die. I spent weeks helping him heal. I know him in ways you never bothered to learn. And I am not going to let you take him back just so you can finish what you started." The silence that followed was absolute. Clayton stared at Eli with an expression that might have been fury, or might have been something else entirely, something almost like grudging respect for this ragged boy who dared to defy him. The ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that suggested they had never seen anyone speak to their employer this way. Even Durrell, who prided himself on professional detachment, seemed taken aback by the intensity of the confrontation unfolding before him. Then Clayton did something unexpected. He laughed. It was not a warm laugh or a kind one, but it was genuine, the sound of a man who had just encountered something so absurd that laughter was the only possible response. He shook his head slowly, and when he looked at Eli again, there was a calculating gleam in his eyes that had not been there before. "You have got spirit, boy," he said. "I will give you that much. More spirit than sense, but spirit nonetheless, so let me make you a proposition." Eli felt a chill run down his spine despite the humid warmth of the morning. He knew instinctively that whatever Clayton was about to offer would not be simple or fair. Men like Clayton Mercer did not make propositions out of generosity. They made them because they saw an angle, an opportunity to win in ways that went beyond the obvious. "You claim you saved that horse," Clayton continued, gesturing toward the barn where Sovereign waited. "You claim he is healed under your care. Fine. Prove it. There is a competition next month at the county fairgrounds, an obstacle course that tests a horse's agility and responsiveness. Enter Sovereign. If he completes the course without fault, I will sign over his ownership papers to you free and clear. But if he fails, if that leg of his gives out or he cannot perform, then you admit publicly that you stole him from me, and you face whatever legal consequences that brings." The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a gauntlet thrown at Eli's feet. He knew he should refuse. He knew the odds were stacked impossibly against him. But when he looked at Clayton Mercer's smug, confident face, something inside him hardened into resolve. "Deal," he said. The moment the words left his mouth, Eli knew he had stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. Clayton Mercer's smile widened into something predatory, the expression of a man who had just maneuvered his opponent exactly where he wanted them. He extended his hand, and Eli shook it, feeling the rancher's grip tighten just enough to communicate the power differential between them. The deal was struck. In 4 weeks, Sovereign would compete in the Hartwell County obstacle course, and everything Eli had fought for would be decided in a matter of minutes on a dirt arena in front of hundreds of watching eyes. After Clayton and his men departed, their trucks disappearing back into the trees with engines fading into silence, Eli stood alone in the clearing and tried to process what he had done. The enormity of the challenge pressed down on him like a physical weight. An obstacle course was not simply about speed or endurance. It required precision, trust between horse and rider, and the kind of training that professional handlers spent years perfecting. Eli had none of that. What he had was a horse with a healing leg, 4 weeks of preparation time, and a stubbornness that refused to accept defeat. It would have to be enough. He would make it enough. That night, Eli sat in the barn with Sovereign, running his fingers through the horse's mane while he spoke aloud the fears he could not voice to anyone else. "I do not know if we can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know if I am good enough to train you, or if your leg is strong enough to handle the course, but I know that giving up is not an option. If we fail, at least we fail trying. At least we show everyone that we refuse to surrender." Sovereign turned his head and pressed his muzzle against Eli's chest, a gesture that had become their silent language of comfort and solidarity. Whatever doubts plagued the boy's mind, the horse's steady presence helped quiet them, if only for a moment. The training began the next morning before the sun had fully risen. Eli had never designed an obstacle course before, but he had watched enough competitions during his wanderings to understand the basic elements. There would be jumps of varying heights, requiring Sovereign to clear barriers without hesitation. There would be weaving poles that tested agility and responsiveness to the rider's commands. There would be bridges and platforms that challenged the horse's confidence and trust. And there would be the clock, counting down every second, transforming each mistake into a penalty that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Eli gathered materials from around the abandoned farmstead, fallen logs, old barrels, wooden planks balanced on sawhorses, and assembled them into a crude approximation of what they might face. The first attempts were discouraging. Sovereign, despite his remarkable recovery, still favored his injured leg when asked to make sudden turns or rapid changes in direction. He knocked over poles, refused jumps, and seemed confused by the demands Eli was placing on him after weeks of gentle rehabilitation. But Eli refused to give in to frustration. He remembered what his father had taught him about working with animals, that patience was more important than speed, that building trust took time, but yielded rewards that force could never achieve. He adjusted his approach, breaking each obstacle into smaller components and praising Sovereign lavishly for every minor success. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, progress began to emerge. By the end of the first week, Sovereign was clearing low jumps without hesitation. By the middle of the second week, he was weaving through poles with something approaching grace. The leg that had once been a liability was strengthening daily, supported by Eli's homemade brace and the carefully designed exercises that promoted flexibility without risking re-injury. More importantly, the communication between boy and horse had evolved into something almost telepathic. Eli could feel Sovereign's intentions through the subtle shifts in his posture, and Sovereign responded to the slightest pressure of Eli's knees or the gentlest tug on his improvised reins. They were becoming a team, not just in function, but in spirit. Word of the upcoming competition spread through Hartwell County with the speed of small-town gossip. The story was too compelling to ignore. A homeless boy challenging the richest rancher in the region with a horse that everyone had written off as finished. Opinions divided sharply along predictable lines. Clayton Mercer's allies dismissed Eli as a delusional vagrant who would humiliate himself publicly and deserve whatever punishment followed. But others, those who had felt the sting of Clayton's arrogance or witnessed his cruelty toward man and animal alike, began to root quietly for the underdog. A few even went further than quiet support. One morning, Eli woke to find a bag of quality horse feed left at the edge of the farmstead, with no note or indication of who had placed it there. Another day, he discovered a proper bridle and saddle hanging from the fence, worn but serviceable, donated by someone who believed his cause was worth supporting. These anonymous gifts touched Eli more deeply than he could express. For so long he had survived by assuming that the world was indifferent at best and hostile at worst. The idea that strangers might care about his fate, that they might see value in what he was trying to accomplish, challenged everything he thought he knew about his place in society. He was not just fighting for Sovereign anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed as worthless, everyone who had ever been thrown away by people with more power than compassion. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead, it lifted him up, gave him strength he did not know he possessed. As the competition drew closer, Eli pushed their training harder than ever before. He constructed higher jumps and tighter weaving patterns. He practiced transitions from walking to cantering to full gallop, demanding precision in every movement. Sovereign rose to meet each new challenge, his competitive spirit rekindled by the intensity of their preparation. The limp that had once marred his stride was now barely visible, a slight hitch that appeared only when he was exhausted and disappeared entirely after rest. He was not the horse he had been before the accident. He was something different now, something forged in adversity and tempered by the unlikely bond he shared with a boy who had refused to let him die. The night before the competition, Eli lay awake in the barn, listening to Sovereign's steady breathing and trying to calm the anxiety that churned in his stomach. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. Tomorrow, they would either prove that second chances were possible, or they would fail in front of everyone who had ever doubted them. The morning of the competition dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself had decided to provide a stage worthy of the drama about to unfold. Eli rose before first light, his nerves too frayed for sleep, and spent the early hours grooming Sovereign with meticulous care. He brushed the horse's coat until it gleamed like burnished copper, combed out every tangle from his mane and tail, and polished the donated saddle until he could see his own reflection in the leather. If they were going to face Clayton Mercer and the judgment of Hartwell County, they would do so looking like they belonged there, not like the cast-offs and discards they had been labeled. The journey to the fairgrounds took nearly 2 hours on foot, Eli leading Sovereign along back roads and forest trails to avoid attention until the last possible moment. As they drew closer, the sounds of the gathering crowd reached them through the trees, a murmur of voices and occasional bursts of laughter that grew louder with every step. Eli's stomach tightened with each passing minute, but Sovereign walked calmly beside him, seemingly untroubled by what lay ahead. The horse's composure helped steady Eli's nerves, reminding him that whatever happened today, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. The Hartwell County Fairgrounds spread across a wide expanse of packed earth and painted fencing, surrounded by wooden bleachers that were already filling with spectators. Eli had never seen so many people gathered in one place. Families with children, farmers in overalls, well-dressed couples from the wealthier parts of the county, all of them drawn by the spectacle of competition and the whispered promise of something extraordinary. Banners fluttered from poles, vendors hawked food and drinks from wheeled carts, and in the center of it all stood the obstacle course itself, a carefully designed gauntlet of jumps, poles, bridges, and barriers that would test every skill Eli and Sovereign had developed over the past month. Clayton Mercer was already there, of course, holding court near the judge's platform with an entourage of associates and admirers. He wore a crisp white shirt and polished boots, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun, every inch the wealthy patriarch surveying his domain. When he spotted Eli approaching with Sovereign, his lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. He raised a hand in mock salute, and the gesture drew attention from those around him, heads turning to see the ragged boy who had dared to challenge the most powerful man in the county. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that Eli could feel pressing against him like a physical force. The registration process was mercifully brief. A harried official checked Eli's name against a list, examined Sovereign with professional detachment, and handed over a numbered placard that would identify them during the competition. Eli pinned it to his shirt with trembling fingers, then led Sovereign to the holding area where other competitors waited with their horses. The contrast was stark and immediate. The other entries were sleek, well-fed animals with professional handlers, their equipment polished and expensive, their demeanor speaking of countless hours of formal training. They looked at Eli and Sovereign with expressions ranging from pity to contempt, clearly unable to imagine how this mismatched pair could possibly compete on the same field. But Eli had learned long ago to ignore the judgments of those who knew nothing about his life. He found a quiet corner of the holding area and focused on keeping Sovereign calm and prepared. He checked the brace on the horse's leg one final time, adjusted the fit of the saddle, and spoke in low, soothing tones that only Sovereign could hear. "We have done everything we can," he said, running his hand along the horse's neck. "Now we just have to trust ourselves and each other. Whatever happens out there, I want you to know that you have already proven everyone wrong. You are standing here strong and healthy when they all said you would never walk again. That is already a victory, no matter what the scoreboard says." Sovereign nickered softly and pressed his forehead against Eli's chest, a gesture of affection and trust that made the boy's eyes sting with unexpected emotion. He blinked rapidly and forced himself to focus on the task ahead. There would be time for sentiment later. Right now, he needed to be sharp, alert, ready for anything. The competition began with the professional entries, handlers who had trained for years and horses bred specifically for this type of challenge. Eli watched from the sidelines, studying their techniques, noting which obstacles caused the most difficulty and which approaches seemed most effective. The course was demanding, a winding path that required constant communication between rider and horse, split-second decisions that could mean the difference between a clean run and a disqualifying fault. Several competitors knocked down poles or balked at the water feature that anchored the course's middle section. Even the best of them made minor errors that cost precious seconds. Eli filed away every observation, building a mental map of the course that he would need to navigate when his turn came. Clayton Mercer watched the competition with the satisfied air of a man who had already won. He chatted with judges and sponsors, laughed at jokes that Eli could not hear, and occasionally glanced toward the holding area with an expression that made clear his confidence in the outcome. To him, this was not really a contest. It was a public humiliation waiting to happen, a lesson he would teach this impudent boy about the consequences of challenging one's betters. He had brought his personal veterinarian to the fairgrounds, ready to document any sign that Sovereign's leg had failed, any evidence that could be used to paint Eli as a reckless fool who had endangered an animal's welfare for his own selfish purposes. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, each completed run bringing Eli closer to his moment of truth. When the announcer finally called his name, the sound seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the blood pounding in his ears. He mounted Sovereign with practiced ease, feeling the familiar strength of the horse beneath him, and rode toward the starting line. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Eli could see Clayton Mercer leaning forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the course with predatory intensity. "This is it," Eli whispered, more to himself than to Sovereign. "Everything we have worked for comes down to this moment." The starting horn sounded and they began. And the first jump rose before them like a wall, wooden rails painted white and red that seemed impossibly high in that frozen moment before contact. Eli felt Sovereign gather beneath him, muscles coiling with power that had been rebuilt through weeks of patient care, and then they were airborne, the ground falling away as the horse launched himself over the barrier with a grace that drew an audible gasp from the watching crowd. They landed clean, Sovereign's hooves striking earth with perfect precision, and Eli allowed himself a single heartbeat of relief before focusing on what came next. There was no time for celebration, no room for distraction. The course stretched ahead of them like a serpent waiting to strike, and every obstacle demanded their complete attention. The weaving poles came in rapid succession, a series of vertical markers that required Sovereign to snake his body through narrow gaps with fluid coordination. Eli leaned into each turn, his weight shifting instinctively to guide the horse through the pattern, and Sovereign responded with a responsiveness that spoke of the bond they had forged in their weeks of isolation. Left, right, left, right, the poles blurring past as they moved through the section without touching a single one. Eli heard scattered applause from somewhere in the bleachers, but he pushed the sound away, refusing to let anything break his concentration. They were not even halfway through. The hardest challenges still lay ahead. The water feature appeared before them, a shallow pool that stretched across the course like a moat defending a castle. Many horses balked at water obstacles, frightened by the unfamiliar sensation of splashing through liquid that obscured what lay beneath. Eli had prepared for this, leading Sovereign through the creek near their farmstead until the horse understood that water held no danger. Now that preparation paid dividends as Sovereign plunged into the pool without hesitation, his powerful legs churning through the water and carrying them to the opposite bank with momentum to spare. They emerged dripping but undeterred, and Eli felt a surge of pride for the animal who had trusted him enough to face his fears. The course curved sharply to the left, leading toward a series of elevated platforms that required Sovereign to step up and down with careful balance. This was where the injured leg would be tested most severely, where the strain of climbing and descending would reveal any lingering weakness in the healed bone. Eli slowed their pace slightly, giving Sovereign time to assess each platform before committing, and the horse responded with the measured deliberation of an athlete who understood his own limits. Up, across, down, up, across, down. Each transition was smooth, each landing controlled, and when they cleared the final platform, Eli knew that the worst was behind them. Sovereign's leg had held. The miracle of his recovery was proving itself with every step, but the course was not finished with them yet. The final section began with a double jump, two barriers placed close enough together that clearing the first required immediate preparation for the second. Eli had practiced this sequence dozens of times in their makeshift training ground, and he knew that timing was everything. Too fast, and Sovereign would not have time to gather himself between jumps. Too slow, and they would lose the momentum needed to clear the second barrier. He found the rhythm instinctively, counting the strides in his head, and when Sovereign launched over the first jump, Eli was already shifting his weight forward in anticipation of what came next. 1 heartbeat, 2, and then they were rising again, Sovereign's body stretching toward the sky, and they cleared the second barrier with inches to spare. The crowd was on its feet now, their cheers washing over the course like a wave breaking against rocks. Even those who had dismissed Eli as a fool were caught up in the drama of the moment, witnessing something that transcended mere competition. This was not just a horse running an obstacle course. This was a testament to the power of determination, proof that broken things could be made whole again through patience and love. Eli heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the final stretch of course that separated them from victory, a straight run to the finish line that seemed to extend into infinity. Sovereign ran. His hooves pounded against the packed earth with a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, steady and strong and utterly certain. The finish line approached, a ribbon of red stretched between two poles, and Eli leaned forward over Sovereign's neck, urging him on with everything he had. The seconds stretched like taffy, each one lasting an eternity, and then they were through, the ribbon parting around them as they crossed into territory that Clayton Mercer had never imagined they would reach. The timer stopped. The numbers blinked on the scoreboard, recording a time that placed them not merely in competition but near the top of the standings. Eli pulled Sovereign to a gradual halt, his chest heaving with exertion and emotion, and for a moment he simply sat there, unable to process what they had accomplished. They had done it. Against every expectation, against every obstacle, both literal and figurative, they had proven that Sovereign could still perform, that the horse Clayton Mercer had discarded as worthless was anything but. The crowd's applause thundered around them, but Eli's attention was drawn to a different figure entirely. Clayton Mercer stood near the judge's platform, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into fury. The rancher had expected humiliation, had anticipated watching this ragged boy fail publicly and spectacularly. Instead, he was witnessing the demolition of his certainty, the collapse of assumptions he had held about value and worth, and what made something deserving of care. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and even from across the arena, Eli could see the anger burning in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that Eli had not expected to see. Behind the fury, beneath the wounded pride, was a flicker of something that might have been doubt. Clayton Mercer had built his life on the premise that he knew the value of everything, that his judgment was infallible, that his decisions were always correct. Now, watching a horse he had condemned to death complete an obstacle course with flying colors, he was being forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong. It was a small crack in a very large wall, but it was there nonetheless. Eli dismounted and wrapped his arms around Sovereign's neck, burying his face in the horse's mane. They had one more run to complete, but they had already won something far more important than any competition could offer. The final results were announced as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the fairgrounds and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Eli stood with Sovereign in the holding area, surrounded by a small crowd of spectators who had gathered to offer congratulations and ask questions about the remarkable horse who had captured everyone's attention. He answered as best he could, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion, but his eyes kept drifting toward the judge's platform where officials were tallying scores and preparing to declare the competition's outcome. The waiting was almost unbearable, each minute stretching into what felt like hours as the tension built toward its inevitable release. When the head judge finally stepped to the microphone, the fairgrounds fell silent with an anticipation that seemed to hold the very air in suspension. He cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and began reciting the results in reverse order, starting with the lowest scoring competitors and working his way up. Eli listened with growing disbelief as name after name was called. Professional handlers with expensive horses and years of training, all of them placing below the homeless boy and the discarded stallion that no one had expected to finish the course at all. 4th place, 3rd place, 2nd place. And then, with a pause that seemed designed to maximize the dramatic effect, the judge announced the winner, Eli Walker and Sovereign. The words hit him like a physical force, driving the breath from his lungs and making his knees momentarily weak. He had hoped for survival. He had prayed for a respectable showing that would satisfy the terms of his agreement with Clayton Mercer. He had never, not in his most optimistic moments, imagined that they might actually win. Around him, the crowd erupted into cheers that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. Strangers clapped him on the back and shouted congratulations. Someone pressed a bottle of water into his hand. Sovereign, sensing the excitement, tossed his head and let out a triumphant whinny that rose above the noise like a declaration of victory. But even in that moment of celebration, Eli's thoughts turned to the man who had set this entire chain of events in motion. He searched the crowd for Clayton Mercer and found him standing apart from the festivities, his face pale and his expression unreadable. The rancher had not moved from his position near the judge's platform, had not joined the applause or acknowledged the outcome in any visible way. He simply stood there watching Eli with eyes that seemed to be reassessing everything they saw. The confident swagger that had characterized his every interaction was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. The two of them locked gazes across the crowded fairgrounds, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them that neither could have put into words. Eli saw a man confronting the limits of his own power, realizing for perhaps the first time that money and influence could not guarantee every outcome. Clayton saw a boy who had taken something he discarded and transformed it into something magnificent, accomplishing through patience and love what all his resources had failed to achieve. It was a moment of reckoning, a fulcrum on which the future would pivot, and both of them knew that nothing would be quite the same afterward. Slowly, deliberately, Clayton Mercer began walking toward Eli. The crowd parted before him, conversations dying away as people sensed the significance of what was about to happen. Eli straightened his spine and lifted his chin, refusing to show any sign of intimidation despite the rancher's imposing presence. He had earned the right to stand tall. He had proven himself in the only arena that mattered. Whatever Clayton had to say, Eli would hear it without flinching. Clayton stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving from Eli to Sovereign and back again. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken history. Then, with a gesture that seemed to cost him considerable effort, Clayton reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. Eli recognized it immediately as the ownership papers for Sovereign, the legal proof of the horse's bloodline and value that Clayton had mentioned during their first confrontation. "A deal is a deal," Clayton said, his voice gruff but steady. He extended the papers toward Eli, and when the boy hesitated, he pushed them forward more insistently. "Take them. The horse is yours. You earned it." Eli accepted the papers with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to control them. He looked down at the official stamps and signatures, the formal language that declared Sovereign to be his property in the eyes of the law, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not even realized he was carrying. The horse who had been thrown away, who had been left to die alone in a desolate hollow, was now officially and irrevocably his. No one could take Sovereign away from him. No one could claim that he had stolen what he had rightfully saved. But Clayton was not finished. He stood there for another moment, struggling with words that did not come easily to a man of his disposition. Finally, with what appeared to be genuine difficulty, he spoke again. "I was wrong about that horse. Wrong to give up on him. Wrong to think he was worthless just because he could not race anymore." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "Maybe I was wrong about some other things too." It was not an apology, not exactly, but it was something close. An acknowledgement of error from a man who had built his entire identity on being right. Eli nodded slowly, accepting the concession for what it was worth, and extended his own hand. Clayton looked at it for a moment, surprise flickering across his features, then clasped it firmly. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief contact something shifted between them. Not friendship, perhaps not even respect, but something like understanding. A recognition that both of them, in their different ways, had learned something valuable from this experience. Clayton released Eli's hand and turned away without another word, walking back through the crowd toward where his trucks waited. He did not look back, and Eli did not call after him. Some things were better left unspoken, allowed to settle into the silence where their true meaning could take root and grow. Eli turned to Sovereign and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck once more. "We did it," he whispered. "We really did it." The months that followed the competition brought changes that Eli could never have anticipated during those desperate early days when he had first found Sovereign lying broken in the hollow. The story of the homeless boy and the discarded horse spread far beyond Hartwell County, carried by newspapers and television stations, hungry for tales of redemption and unlikely triumph. Journalists arrived at the abandoned farmstead seeking interviews. Photographers captured images of Eli and Sovereign that would appear in publications across the country, and suddenly the boy who had spent years trying to remain invisible found himself at the center of attention he had never sought. He handled it with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his approach to everything else, answering questions honestly but briefly, deflecting praise toward the horse who had truly earned it, and refusing to speak ill of Clayton Mercer despite the opportunities that reporters eagerly provided. The attention brought practical benefits that transformed Eli's circumstances in ways both large and small. Donations arrived from strangers moved by his story, enough money to repair the abandoned farmstead and stock it with supplies that would last through multiple winters. A local veterinarian offered free care for Sovereign, ensuring that the horse's recovery would be monitored by professional expertise rather than improvised remedies. Most importantly, a lawyer who had followed the competition contacted Eli with news that would change his life forever. Through a combination of legal maneuvering and public pressure, she had secured the rights to the farmstead property, which had been abandoned so long that its original owners could not be located. The land was now officially Eli's, a home he could never be evicted from, a foundation on which he could build whatever future he chose. But Eli's ambitions extended beyond his own security. The experience of rescuing Sovereign had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose that demanded expression beyond the boundaries of his own small story. He began taking in other animals, horses and dogs, and even a few farm animals that had been abandoned or abused by owners who saw them as disposable. The farmstead evolved into an unofficial sanctuary, a place where broken creatures could find healing and damaged spirits could be restored. Eli discovered that the skills he had developed while caring for Sovereign translated readily to other animals, that his patience and gentleness could reach even the most traumatized beings and coax them back toward trust. Word spread through the county, and soon people were bringing him animals they had found or could no longer care for, knowing that Eli would treat them with the compassion they deserved. Sovereign remained at the center of it all, The founding member and unofficial ambassador of the growing sanctuary, his transformation from a discarded racing horse to a symbol of second chances inspired everyone who visited, proof that worth could not be measured by utility alone. Children from local schools came to meet him, running their small hands along his gleaming coat while Eli told them the story of how they had found each other. Adults who had given up on their own dreams found new determination in his example. Even Clayton Mercer, in a development that surprised everyone including himself, became an occasional visitor to the farmstead, watching from a distance as Sovereign grazed peacefully in pastures that had once been overgrown with weeds. The rancher never fully explained what drew him back to the place where his assumptions had been so thoroughly dismantled. Perhaps it was curiosity about how his former horse was faring. Perhaps it was a form of penance for the cruelty he had shown. Or perhaps he simply needed to see again and again the evidence that he had been wrong, that his way of measuring value had failed to account for something essential about the nature of living things. Whatever his reasons, Clayton began making anonymous donations to support the sanctuary's operations, contributions that Eli accepted without comment or acknowledgement. Some debts could only be repaid through action, and Clayton seemed to understand that his path to redemption would be measured in deeds rather than words. Years passed, and the sanctuary that had grown from Eli's desperate rescue of a single horse became an established institution in Hartwell County. Volunteers arrived regularly to help with feeding and maintenance. Veterinary students completed rotations there, learning approaches to animal care that emphasized connection and trust alongside medical intervention. The abandoned farmstead was barely recognizable now, its buildings restored and expanded, its pastures lush with grass that had been carefully cultivated to provide optimal nutrition for the animals in residence. Eli, no longer a homeless boy but a respected member of the community, oversaw it all with the same quiet competence that had characterized his approach from the very beginning. But no matter how busy his days became, Eli always made time for Sovereign. Every morning before the volunteers arrived and the daily responsibilities demanded his attention, he would walk to the pasture where the chestnut stallion waited and spend a few minutes in silent communion with the horse who had changed everything. Sovereign was older now, his muzzle touched with gray and his movements slower than they had been during that triumphant run through the obstacle course. But his eyes still held the same intelligence, the same gentle spirit that had recognized a kindred soul in the ragged boy who had refused to let him die. They would stand together in the early morning light, breathing the same air, sharing the same peace, and Eli would remember all the moments that had brought them to this place. On one such morning, as the sun rose over the hills and painted the world in shades of gold and pink, Eli spoke aloud the words that had lived in his heart for so long. "You saved me, you know," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Everyone thinks I saved you, but the truth is that finding you gave me a reason to keep going. You taught me that broken things can heal, that being thrown away does not mean being worthless. You showed me what I was capable of when I had something worth fighting for." Sovereign turned his great head and regarded Eli with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of their shared history. Then, as he had done so many times before, he pressed his forehead against the boy's chest and in that simple gesture communicated everything that words could never capture. They remained that way for a long moment, horse and human united by a bond that had defied every expectation and overcome every obstacle. Some connections, Eli understood, transcended explanation. Some miracles were meant simply to be accepted with gratitude and honored with lives well lived, and that was exactly what he intended to do.